Stanford University.
Thank you for coming tonight, everybody. My name is Charlie Junkerman. I'm the Dean of Continuing Studies, and it's my pleasure just to say a few words of welcome and then get out of the way. We all watched as the conference in Copenhagen unfolded over those weeks in December, nervously, curiously, sometimes with foreboding that nothing was going to come out of this. I think many of us who care deeply about climate change, global warming, aren't even sure what has come out of Copenhagen, and it's one of the reasons we're here tonight to find out. Terry and Meg both went to Copenhagen. They're freshly back. These are Meg's pictures. They went with a contingent of 31 people from Stanford, and not only that, they of course went with deep knowledge and experience as environmental scientists and scholars. They've generously agreed to put together this course for us, inviting their colleagues, principally from the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford, to join them. As you can see from the syllabus that you have, every week somebody else is going to come, and over the course of the 10 weeks of this quarter, we'll get a perspective on climate change, global warming, which will give us a comprehensive understanding of what's happening and what we can expect. The course is being offered both as a continuing studies course. I'm looking around, most of you, I'm guessing, are our folks, continuing studies. It's also being offered as a graduate and undergraduate course through the Earth Systems program at Stanford. How many of you here are Stanford students taking this through Earth Systems? Keep your hands up, okay? Because 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So 13, there are actually 20 enrolled, so that's good. Thanks for being here. Yeah, great. I'm going to say just a few words about Terry and Meg and then get out of the way, okay? Meg Caldwell, who's going to speak tonight, is a senior lecturer in Stanford's law school, where she's also the director of the Environmental and Natural Resources Law and Policy program. At the Woods Institute, she's the executive director of the Center for Ocean Solutions, which is a collaboration between Stanford, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, right, which you call BARI, don't you? MBARI, sorry, I thought it was something clever like that, MBARI, right? Meg is a well-respected figure in environmental law and was selected as the chair of the California Coastal Commission, served on that body for nearly 3 years. While chair of the commission, she also served on the board of the California Coastal Conservancy, and was appointed by the State Secretary of Resources to the California Marine Life Protection Act Blue Ribbon Task Force. That's a mouthful. You can tell that Meg's specialty is oceans, right? And California is lucky to have her here. Before joining the Stanford Law School, she was an instructor at San Jose State and at the University of California, Davis, and also in law practice with the environmental law group McCutcheon, Doyle, Brown, and Enerson. So that's Meg Caldwell, who will speak to you tonight. Terry Root, the co-convener, co-director of the course, is senior fellow at the Woods Institute. Her work is principally on birds, but on large scale, more globally, large-scale ecological factors shaping the ranges and abundances of all animals. She wrote an influential book called The Atlas of Wintering North American Birds, an analysis of Christmas bird count data, and also did an analysis of environmental data from a number of her colleagues, and came to this conclusion. She found a strong global signal that both animals and plants are changing along with the increase in global temperature, changing their behavior. They're shifting their ranges poleward and up in elevation, and have been changing, this is interesting, the time of spring events like migrations and blooming by 5 days per decade over the last 30 years. Quite significant. These findings will, of course, help forecast possible consequences of global warming on animal communities. Terry teaches courses in conservation biology, wildlife ecology, wildlife biology, and ornithology. In 1989, she became an elective member of the American Ornithologists Union, AOU, the largest professional ornithology society in North America. She was elected to the governing council of the AOU in 1993 and became a fellow in 1995. both good fellows who are here tonight to start us off on our journey over the next 10 weeks. Terry will speak to you first and then turn the microphone over to Meg. So please welcome Terry Root.
I thought it would be a really good time to try and pull something together. And Meg and I have been talking about it, and it really is one of those classes that has just fallen together. It really just came together almost all by itself. So what I would like to do, do you know what this is? That's Iceland. Sorry, that's Greenland. Sorry, it's Greenland. That was when I flew over it and I was looking at all the ice that was not there anymore. Okay, let's get going here. The book for the class is this, Science is a Contact Sport. The reason that it is it's a fantastic history of what has gone on in the US as far as climate change goes. So it is in the bookstore. I went over there today to check it out and to make sure that it is there. And there's not going to be read this chapter this time and read this chapter this time. It's whenever you have the chance, go ahead and read it through it. We are going to have readings most of the time for each lecture. And what we are going to do then is we've got three different types. I don't have any place to put things down. Okay. We've got three different types of people here. We've got people who are with the continuing studies that is taking it for credit. Those that are not taking it for credit, thank you, sir. And those taking it for credit, those taking it for not for credit, and the people who are signed up through Stanford. The people who are signed up through Stanford, after the class, will you come and see me and we'll go through some things at that point. Now, because there's three different types of people here, we're going to be teaching this in a very general manner so that it'll apply to everyone. So the things that the Stanford students are doing, you all are welcome to do if you want to. And you don't have to if you don't want to. So let me go through now. Oops. So today is Meg Caldwell, and she's going to be talking on Copenhagen, the meeting, and its impacts in oceans. I'm going through this. Next time was supposed to be Michael Wara, but we're going to have to do some switching around. I apologize for that. But when he does speak with you, it will be on the Copenhagen Accord. He is an attorney and here at Stanford, and he has been working very much with all of the legal aspects of this accord, because you can sit down and read the accord and not really understand what's going on very well. Then we're going to have a woman, Dr. Christy Ebi, and she is the head of the technical support unit of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, Working Group 2, and it is for the 5th assessment report. And the whole TSU, the Technical Support Unit, for that working group is here on campus. It's run through Carnegie University, that is here on Stanford campus. She has agreed to come in and talk to us about help from the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change at Copenhagen. And was it a help? Was it a hindrance? And I'm not sure I could answer that one. In some ways it was a help, and in some ways it was a real hindrance. Okay. Then on February 4th, we have Steve Schneider, and he's the one who wrote the book, Rapid Global Warming, Copenhagen Accord to the Rescue, ? Then what we have is February 11th, and I would like you all to put this into your calendars. February 11th, we're going to have to run over probably by about a half an hour, 45 minutes. So it's going to be a late night, so I hope there's a basketball game so they can all get out of here and we'll then be able to go home easily. Anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to be watching a movie and a rebuttal. And the movie is The Global Warming Swindle, and it was directed by Martin Durkin, and it was done by Channel 4 in England. And then Tony Jones in Australia showed this on one of his shows, and then he got together a bunch of scientists to actually rebut what was shown in the shows. So it's quite an amazing, it really is quite an amazing evening that will be. The other thing too is I think what we will do is leave time to ask questions, because there's going to be a lot of questions that are going to be brought up by all of that. Okay, then we're lucky enough to have Ben Santor, and he's a scientist, a very distinguished scientist from Livermore Labs, and he is the person who, in the second assessment report of the IPCC, said that there is a discernible impact of humans on climate. So it was his chapter, he's the one who did it, he's the one who got harassed for it, and he is being harassed horribly. So what he wants to do is talk about identifying the facts, the values, the lies, and the fiction. And how do you put information into each of those things? And he really is getting quite, it's getting quite nasty. One evening, the doorbell rang, and he went downstairs to look what was going on, and a yellow Hummer was driving away, and at his doorstep was an eviscerated rat. So this naysayer, whatever, struggle that's going on is unfortunately too real. Then I'm going to be speaking to you, and I have to talk about plants and animals, things like this. So how much CO2 is a bird, fish, or a nematode worth? So do we want to go ahead and have extinction of some species so that we can continue to have our lifestyles? That's really the question. Then we hope we will have Carol Browner and Fran Pavley. Carol Browner is the national climate czar, basically climate and energy czar. She was appointed by Obama. And Fran Pavley is probably the person who has done more for this world than I think any of us in this room put together times 10. She is the person who put together the bill here in California to work on global warming and emissions, to limit the emissions. And she is now senator. She was a congressperson before, and before that she was a middle school teacher. So I guess she had really good training to do what she's doing now. So anyway, they're going to be talking about the politics behind it all. Then we are lucky enough to have Lisa Curran. Lisa Curran is a brand new professor here at Stanford. She has come from Yale, and before that she came from Michigan. That's where I knew her. I was at Michigan for 14 years. And what Lisa does is she works internationally trying to figure out what is going on with climate change and plants primarily. Primarily she's looking at plants, but she's not looking at them in a normal way. She's looking at them at how stable things are and can be, and how the emissions is maybe making ecosystems, basically unbalancing ecosystems. So she's going to be talking a little bit about the international implications. And then we have John Krosnick, and he also is at Stanford. It's an amazing group of people that we have here at Stanford. It is really quite striking. John Krosnick, he is the person who does the analysis of the polls. So he does all these polling. ABC, NBC, CNN, Harris, all of these various people, groups, get John Krosnick to help them do polls. And what he has done is actually looking at why does the general public listen to the climate change deniers? And that will tell us a little bit more. I have seen him give a talk one time, and afterwards I went up to him and I said, you know what, if I had a different life, I would love to go and be a postdoc in your lab and learn how to do what you're doing. Because I think what he's doing is actually telling us where the next frontier is for us to be working. This is where we need to be working. So anyway, I think the world of him. And then that's the end of the class.
The mission of the Center for Ocean Solutions is to elevate the impact of the natural, physical, and social sciences on ocean policy. So between and among just these three institutions, we have got over 80 faculty members and researchers who specialize in oceans and coasts. And so the whole idea is to basically catalyze that incredible knowledge and expertise and creativity on behalf of the oceans, and to address the biggest ocean challenges together, and to ultimately affect some transformational change on behalf of the oceans. Our initial funding was from the Packard Foundation. We received a $25 million grant that was intended to be spent down over a 10-year period. So the expectation is that we will be continually seeking other funding to support the work of the Center for Ocean Solutions and to support the research that we will definitely be doing to move ahead with these major ocean challenges. So look out for us in the future. We have 3 focal areas for the center. The first is climate change. The second is land-sea interactions, and the third is ecosystem health and ecosystem services. We've already begun work on ecosystem health and ecosystem services, and for that, we've undertaken a major project that is funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation that's focused on developing a whole new way of managing California's marine resources, to do it in a spatial way rather than in a sectoral way. So what I mean by that is, rather than following the current path, in fact the path that the United States has followed for the last 30 some odd years, where you deal with fisheries separate from dealing with aquaculture, separate from dealing with energy facilities, separate from dealing with shipping and ports and harbors and water quality and coastal development, to sort of look at that whole network of human activities in a more comprehensive way, and to think about our oceanscape as a spatial place where we can proactively decide what kind of human activities should be taking place where, and how can we best steward these marine resources that we have for ecosystem health, essentially. So it's like, use it and protect it at the same time, but think about this very proactively rather than reactively, which is how we currently manage our ocean resources. So it's this is actually, we call this marine spatial planning, multi-objective marine spatial planning that's ecosystem-based. And the Obama administration, just towards the end of last year, well, actually June of last year, announced that they were going to be developing a brand new national ocean policy. And part of that national ocean policy would be to develop a whole new framework for ecosystem-based, science-driven marine spatial planning. So we're right on the cutting edge of national ocean policy with this project that we've already started.
The ocean tends to be off of the radar screen for a lot of people. It's out there away from the coast. You know, most people's experience, if you ask them, what do you know about the ocean? They immediately start talking about their coastline, right? Well, the ocean's much bigger than that. One of the things I work on is how the chemistry of the ocean is changing over time. Normally how all this work's been done so far is scientists go out into the field and they'll select an organism, grab it, bring it back to the lab, and what we're doing that nobody's done before is we're taking our lab into the field. We drill coral cores, and that's how we examine variability in the climate system. This is a 4-meter-long coral core, and this one goes back several centuries. And as you work your way over, we go back through the entire 1800s, and all the way back down to the bottom. This coral started growing in the year 1692. Yeah, it's the history of the world right there. It's a library, it's a book of climate change. But we always ask the question, what drives these changes? We used to think of other explanations, but we keep getting focused back on carbon dioxide as the prime variable.
What's happened is, unfortunately, nature has been cooperating with theory, and the prediction of warming is taking place at least as fast as it was suggested, and faster in many cases. The buildup of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases is higher than was predicted.
Every time we see an increase in CO2 content of the ocean, that surface water becomes a little bit more acidic, and it affects organisms that live there. The temperature and the acidification are going to work together. The two acting in concert, you know, is this kind of knockout 1-2 punch. My hope for a meeting like Copenhagen is that the oceans appear more prominently on the list of things we should be worried about and the list of things that we should be examining.
Copenhagen is close to the last-ditched effort that we have for the planet to get together while there's still some time to avoid really dangerous consequences.
If you want to know where we are in this ongoing experiment, where are we in this pathway into the world of the future, you have to know the temperature of the ocean. See you in Copenhagen.
So we went to Copenhagen. The Center for Ocean Solutions had a small cohort. We brought with us Rob Dunbar, who you saw in this film. He's a geologist and a professor who has been studying the oceans for his entire professional career. I'd have him here tonight, but he's down in Antarctica, actually, looking at how quickly the western Antarctic ice shelf is melting. Just a little clue, and I'll talk about this later. It's melting far faster than any of us had projected. So Rob Dunbar and myself, I had 2 staff members with us, and we also brought with us Professor Hugh Goldberg from the University of Queensland, who actually runs the Stanford in Australia program. And he too is an ocean expert. He specializes in coral reefs and the impacts of climate change on coral reefs. He's just been named as the head of the Global Change Institute at the University of Queensland. Our goal, as Rob said, was to really try to get oceans on the map. They were nowhere on the map. In fact, I shouted out, "Why not oceans?" on Terry's list. And they weren't on the map. They weren't on anybody's radar screen. We went there, we held a couple of press conferences, one in collaboration with the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. We participated in Oceans Day, which is a full day held not at the Bella Center, which is where all the negotiations were taking place, because there's no place for oceans at the Bella Center, but rather at the European Union's Environment Agency, which happens to be headquartered in Copenhagen. So we held that complete day focused on oceans, where experts from around the planet were talking to the delegates who managed to leave Bella Center and come out to the European Union's Environment Agency and get briefed on exactly what was going on between oceans and climate. And we learned quite a bit through that entire experience. Of course, we learned that oceans are not on the radar screen. We also learned that there's very poor ocean literacy across the sort of leaders of such an important effort to figure out how to tackle climate change. We learned that folks aren't even using the same units of measure when they're talking about how to tackle climate change. Some are talking in terms of carbon dioxide parts per million in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide in terms of parts per million. Others are talking about CO2 equivalent parts per million. Well, for the oceans, that makes a huge difference, because the CO2 uptake of the oceans is changing their chemistry radically. So those are just a few quick reflections on Copenhagen. What I wanted to do is just explore with you some of the major issues between the oceans and climate, so that you have a better sense of why the oceans are so important, and possibly the sort of, what I would say, the foremost and most significant immediate victim of climate change. Now I know we're losing a lot of species, they're moving in the terrestrial realm, but we're finding the same thing in our marine and coastal systems. So that's my goal for today, really, to talk a little bit about what the lead up to Copenhagen was all about, how that fits in with a history of climate change negotiations generally on the planet, and then to talk a bit about oceans and climate. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, actually has a goal, and the goal is, the explicit goal is to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions and concentrations in the atmosphere so that we can prevent dangerous anthropogenic climate change and interference with our climate system. This goal is longer than the goal of the UNFCCC is actually longer. It goes on to talk about to do so in a manner that would allow the natural systems to basically rebound and recuperate themselves. So not to go so far past natural thresholds that our systems as we know them today cannot actually recuperate and continue to provide the kinds of ecosystem services that we look to them to provide for us. Ecosystem services, anybody heard of them before? Everybody? Anybody not heard of ecosystem services? Okay, a couple people haven't. So for someone who nodded yes, can you briefly describe what we mean by ecosystem services? Oh, come on. This is supposed to be a dialogue, yeah.
I seem to recall when I heard that it's about what an ecosystem does for us in terms of contributing, like generating oxygen for trees.
Exactly. Speaking of oxygen, do you know how much of the oxygen you breathe is provided by the oceans? 50%, that's right. And who's responsible for generating that oxygen in the oceans? Plankton, the teeniest life forms in the ocean. So yeah, so ecosystem services is a very human-oriented articulation of the environment. And it basically talks about what kinds of goods and services are provided by our ecosystems, terrestrial and marine ecosystems, that we value. So it's all about what humans care about. And that's an okay construct. It works for me as long as we are valuing these goods and services irrespective of the fact that we may have financial markets that can apply dollar values to those goods and services. So that's where things start to break down a bit. When we have very important services like things that we call supporting services, the creation of soil, for example, or the bottom of the food chain, the plankton and zooplankton. There's no market for those things right now, but they're incredibly valuable. So let's go on the timeline a little bit. The first World Climate Conference was actually a little over 30 years ago. And then, I have the exact date somewhere here, but sometime right before 1990, the IPCC was established. What is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? Anybody know? Come on. Somebody knows. The IPCC. Terry, yeah, what's the IPCC? Chris Eby, who actually is going to come and talk with you, is working with the IPCC. So the IPCC is a global panel of experts that has been convened to actually provide solid, credible, scientific input to the global negotiations on climate change, to this mission of the UNFCCC of reducing greenhouse gas atmospheric concentrations so that we no longer have dangerous climate change. That's their role. So what they do is they talk about, they give projections of what we can expect in the future in terms of atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. They talk about the consequences of those concentrations, the kinds of reverberating changes that are occurring in our marine and terrestrial systems as a result of increasing temperatures and other impacts from climate change. And they talk about the social costs associated with us as well. So not just the physical changes that are occurring, but the social costs. And the IPCC also tries to give us a really good sense of what the probabilities are. So, you know, what kind of risks are we taking right now with continued sort of business as usual operations and continued discharge of greenhouse gas emissions into our atmosphere? So these are very tricky things. All of those things that I just listed are incredibly difficult. And the way the IPCC functions is incredibly laborious. So I think some of the fun that you're going to have when Chris comes in is to learn about how this body actually operates. There are thousands of scientists who are involved in this effort, holding gazillions of meetings in between the major conferences of parties. So it's really a daunting thing to think about and an incredible undertaking. So the first IPCC report was actually issued in the early 90s. Then the UNFCCC, which was actually formally adopted by the United Nations in the early 90s, it entered into force because it had a sufficient number of countries adopting it. And the first Conference of Parties was actually in '96 in Berlin. So every year from that first Conference of Parties, there is a successive Conference of Parties. Now, typically, and we just had one in Copenhagen, the Conference of Parties is an assembly of delegates from every nation on the globe. The delegates come and talk about what they're learning from the IPCC and what they think collectively the globe's nations should be doing to address that and to achieve the mission of the UNFCCC. So up until this last year, it was always just delegates. You never had the heads of state, all the heads of state coming together. Copenhagen was the first time that you had all the parties, heads of state, really coming together, and that was a really big shift. And it meant that there was a lot at stake to have heads of state present in Copenhagen. Another report, then we had COP3 with the Kyoto Protocol. Anyone recall what the Kyoto Protocol actually achieved, what the agreement was there? That's okay. So I'm going to look at so it was signed by, 184 countries had ratified it. Has the U.S. ratified the Kyoto Protocol yet? No, we have not.
Wait a second, I thought it did, and then when Bush came in, he took the signature.
You know, we never did. Yeah, that was wishful thinking on your part. We never did. So the agreement, the commitment, the legally binding, presumably legally binding commitment that was actually ratified by so many countries, 184, was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by an average of, actually CO2 emissions, by an average of 5% against 1990 levels by the year 2012. Now, one of the really discouraging things that we learned in Copenhagen is that everybody has fallen far short of that goal. So the Kyoto goal will not be achieved. And another thing that occurred in Copenhagen is that basically the notion that Kyoto will continue to serve as a binding agreement between those countries that ratified it is completely up in the air. So moving right along.
Yeah, it's not very binding if nobody met it.
Pardon me?
It can't be very binding if nobody met it.
Exactly. So, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, this whole issue of will we ever have a binding agreement again? So moving on, we have another IPCC report. The protocol entered into force. Whoops, didn't really do much. A fourth report. And across the top, you can see what our CO2 atmospheric concentrations are. And finally, Copenhagen. So we're now at about 400 parts per million CO2. Do you know the level exactly, Terry? Anyways, 387. Pardon? We're still 387? Okay.
Is it parts per million?
CO2.
CO2 or CO2 equivalent?
This is CO2 up here. CO2 equivalent, we're in the 400s.
Yeah. So do we know? Because that's
Anybody know exactly what the CO2 equivalent concentration is right now?
What's the difference?
Oh, well, actually, so you said it's really important. For CO2 equivalents, we are well over 400, yes.
So presumably it's just taking into account other greenhouse gases.
Like methane, which is one of these super, sort of superhero or anti-superhero greenhouse gases that is way more powerful than CO2. And one of the big concerns about the melting polar areas is the release of methane from the permafrost, that we could look forward to even larger concentrations of this very critical gas as our ice sheets continue to melt. Yeah, so Terry just said something under her breath. Why do we concentrate on CO2? Are there some ideas about why we concentrate? Yeah.
Because it stays around.
Stays around.
That's one, and the other one is since you're an ocean person, you probably don't care so much about nitrous oxide or CFCs as you do CO2.
Yeah, well, I do care about some other greenhouse gases. Methane, for example, will degrade to CO2, so I really do care about that. But I definitely care about CO2 because it's changing the chemistry of the ocean, and there's some more hands here.
That's what I was going to say, is that CO2, I think in the news mostly portrays it as a gas that traps heat, and the lesser issue is the acidification of the oceans.
Yeah, see, acidification just hasn't made it into the mainstream media, so we're going to change that.
But I'm not understanding. So if we're at 420 parts per million CO2 equivalents, if you add the methane in, it's like equivalent to more CO2.
Yeah, in terms of warming.
Yeah, so in terms of the environment, I would suggest, for policy's sake, we go for the higher number.
Okay. You actually, you and AOSIS, the Association of Small Island States, agree, okay? So when Steve Schneider is here and Michael Wara is here, you can have a really good discussion about this. One of the other reasons why we use CO2 is because, Terry, go ahead.
It's measurable, and we can actually figure out how to work on the emissions of that. When you're talking about methane, it's much more difficult because it is out in the permafrost and it's also in clathrates. So
it's easier to manage CO2 emissions, if you can believe that.
But there's not really a safe CO2 limit. When you said 350 is okay, for species 350 may not be okay. So all it is just a way of measuring something.
These are all arbitrary lines that have been drawn,
exactly.
And the our terrestrial and marine ecosystems have really evolved over time to function as we generally know them in about a 280 parts per million CO2 world. So if you really want to talk about safe levels, you might be talking about 280 parts per million, for example. Now, the rest of the world is not talking so much about, at least in Copenhagen, was not focused on atmospheric carbon concentrations. They were focused on 2 degrees. 2 degrees, okay? And the question that I want to pose to you, is 2 degrees, a safe level for the oceans? I question that, and many of us do. So a lot of countries basically came in thinking if we could just keep our warming, global warming, to 2 degrees, that would be a satisfactory outcome from Copenhagen. And ironically, in March, the scientific community convened in Copenhagen, those who are intimately involved with the IPCC and folks who have contributed a great deal of the science that's going into the IPCC reports convened. And the way one of the lead scientists articulated this whole idea of having 2 degrees as a target is said, basically, we have the same chance as playing Russian roulette of achieving a 2-degree total global warming if we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. And we peak out on our greenhouse gas emissions at 2015.
80% of what year's level?
1990.
So 80% of 90's level.
So I just don't see us doing that. Call me crazy. So let's go back to oceans and climate and really focus on that, and that's what I wanted to really achieve tonight. So oceans cannot be severed from global climate. They're inextricably linked. Oceans cover what percentage of the globe? 70%. You guys are great. Let me get to my statistics here because I want to make sure that I'm citing. So they take up, 70% of the Earth's surface, and they have actually absorbed, if you can believe it, up to a third of, all, half to a third to a half of all CO2 emissions since the Industrial Revolution, listen to me, and so the late 1800s. So they've actually absorbed heat and taken up CO2 and buffered us from the real impacts of our greenhouse gas emission diet. And it's had real consequences on the ocean, and that's what I want to introduce you to tonight. So this slide was really meant to just talk about the ecosystem services that we get from the oceans. Everything from our coastal wetlands, like the mangrove forest that's shown here on the far left, that actually is a key component of our coral reef systems, which support about 25% of the marine life in our oceans. They also protect coastal communities and infrastructure from storm surge and sea level rise, to the aesthetic and recreational value that we get out of the oceans, to the energy that actually our coastal and marine ecosystems can provide. Incredible protein. This is an aquaculture farm here on the bottom right. And they're the primary means of actually shipping goods around the globe. Air travel or air transport is becoming less and less significant as a way of shipping goods around the world, and marine shipping is actually going to increase. So what are the primary impacts of climate change on oceans? Well, ocean warming, ocean acidification, and changes in ocean circulation are the three areas that our scientific community are most concerned about. So I'm going to go through some of those impacts more specifically. Ocean acidification. Anyone know what this beautiful architectural thing is? What? Ooh, radiolarian. Yeah, what else? I like that. I want to see a radiolarian. Yeah.
Is it
Coccolithophore, yes, which is what? It's a nanoplankton. It's a really small plankton. So many of, and plankton, as we already said, not only do they give us every other breath we take, but they're also at the very base of the marine food chain and food web. And many of the plankton and zooplankton that are really at the bottom and the foundation of the marine food web have calcareous structures here. And what happens as the ocean becomes more and more acidic? So CO2 is absorbed through the ocean. I'm not going to do a chemistry lesson because I am not a chemist, so I'm not going to go through that process. But as CO2 is absorbed, it actually becomes more acidic to the extent that since the Industrial Revolution, the oceans have become 30% more acidic. And that means that animals like this and plant life like this have greater difficulty forming their carbonic shells. It also has other consequences for marine organisms, and acidosis is one of them. Anybody heard of acidosis? So acidosis is actually the process by which it's a biophysical change that occurs in organisms where their bodily fluids become more acidic. And scientists are starting to pick that up in marine organisms, in fish and marine mammals. And they're also starting to correlate this acidosis with diminishment of sort of fundamental survival techniques for some of the species that they're studying. It's particularly affecting larval stages of some fish that have been studied, for example. And sound absorption. What does that have to do with acidification?
The ocean becomes noisier.
Yeah, it's becoming noisier. Who discovered that? Who figured that out? Anybody know? You'd think so. Maybe they did. Maybe they figured it out first. But actually, the guy who really brought this to light is a scientist at MBARE called Peter Brewer. And he just got really curious. He had been measuring increasing acidification in the Monterey Bay area, our central coast. And he and one of his postdocs just decided to look at, I wonder if that has any impact on the way sound travels in the ocean. And they found that it does, and particularly with the lower frequencies. For which organisms are the lower frequencies more important in the ocean? Yeah. So it's a bummer for the whales. So just as we're using our oceans more and more for shipping, which produces incredible noise, and of course we have, pardon? Right, and continued use of sonar. The California Coastal Commission tried to address that, but we lost at the U.S. Supreme Court. So the continued use of sonar and all the other noise that we introduce into our marine environment collides in a most pernicious way with ocean acidification as the oceans become noisier and noisier.
Is that just because it changes the density?
Yes. So that's a quickie on ocean acidification. Yes?
Has the ocean been this acidic or more acidic in the past?
Ah, yes. So in geologic history, there have been times where the ocean has been this acidic. There are times when it's well exceeded 2 degrees Celsius warming, and it's exceeded CO2 concentrations of 450 parts per million. Those happen to correspond with periods of mass extinction on Earth. So one thing that was really interesting at the March meeting in Copenhagen, and Terry, you weren't there, but Chris Field from the Carnegie Institute, Ken Caldwell, who's an expert in ocean acidification, many other, Pam Matson, who's the Dean of Earth Sciences from Stanford, many of them were there. And some of the most interesting talks that we attended were those talks where folks had looked back in geologic time and tried to see when have we been as warm as we expect to be by the end of this century? When have we had atmospheric concentrations at 450 parts per million? When have the oceans been this acidic? And what do we know about the planet at that time? And they were able to actually demonstrate that those were the periods of mass extinctions. So it's not really a good story. Ocean warming, sea level rise. So sea level rise, yeah.
Sorry, one question going back. So the levels have been higher. What about the rates of change?
Excellent question. Yeah, because actually a lot of people feel a little pacified by the fact, the Earth's been like this before, and after all, we're here, and corals, a few corals made it through those rough spots, and so it's going to be fine for. And I think this is a point that I think Terry has really important work on, and folks who have looked at similar changes in the marine realm. George Somero, who was the just recently prior director of Hopkins Marine Station, have looked at this. And species are moving and changes are occurring, but the rate of change, the rate of warming, the rate of acidification, the rate of sea level rise is far surpasses anything that scientists have seen in geologic in the Earth's geologic history, except where there were sort of cataclysmic events, okay? So I'm of course just a stupid little lawyer, so I don't want to you to rely exclusively on me for this information, but I think that Terry and the other scientists that are coming to speak with you can speak very eloquently about the rate of change and the consequences for life on this planet and the ability of species and populations to adapt so quickly to this rapid rate of change that we're seeing. Most species, like us, who live a really long time and reproduce relatively late in our lifespan, are very poorly adapted for rapid change. It's the bacteria on the planet and viruses and maybe some plankton that might fare a little better. Okay, so ocean warming, sea level rise. Do you want a break? No, we started late. Okay, and besides, we want to leave time for more questions if we have them. Sea level rise is occurring from two major things. Thermal expansion from the warming of sea surface temperatures are increasing. And you all know what happens to water. You put it into a freezer and it contracts. You take it out and then it expands. So that's thermal expansion of our oceans. So sea levels.
That's the opposite.
Oh, opposite. How did I get that? Pardon me?
It freezes, it expands.
That's true.
Use mercury.
Yeah, you're basically right, except
Mercury
0
gets
to 4
warmer.
degrees centigrade.
Anything gets warmer, it expands.
Anything gets warmer, it expands. What? I like the guy who said you're basically right.
Basically right, except from around 0 to 4 degrees centigrade, in which it actually expands when it gets colder, maybe 0 minus.
There we go.
That causes the water to break ice to break.
I gotta keep. Yeah, I gotta keep to what so I do know that as the oceans have warmed, they actually have expanded. And one thing that's really interesting about sea level around the globe is that it's not uniform. So there are patches of the ocean that are actually warmer than other patches, and they actually have a higher elevation than other areas. So this is not a uniformly experienced condition around the globe. The second thing that's happening is our ice sheets and polar areas are melting and glaciers are melting, and that's contributing to sea level rise as well. So yeah, you had that kind of funny look on your face that it's not uniform. You didn't realize that, or isn't that cool? In fact, it's one of the things that scientists look for when they're looking at oceanographic conditions. It's one of the features that they look for on the globe to see where ocean elevation is higher or lower. And it can be an indicator of ocean temperature. Yeah, we couldn't do it until we had the satellites, yeah. All right, we're gonna get a scientist in to answer your question on that one. So trends in sea level, they've been going up consistently since the late 1800s. This is a 90% confidence level here with the error bars. And this tracks very nicely with the sea level rise data that we have for Central California, actually, and for San Francisco Bay, as a matter of fact. Yes? Any? Nope? Okay. Pardon me? It's not worth going into. You really want to know what the blue dots were? Come see me after class, because I have the red, the blue, the black, but I don't think it's especially worth looking into. So the information that we have about Greenland, which is depicted here, and Antarctica is not good. It's all melting much faster than we thought. The kinds of projections that we're looking at now, where we had been looking at maybe 0.6 meters sea level rise, the scientific community now is saying 1.4 meters sea level rise is expected by the end of the century. So that's about 7 feet, okay? Now, if Western Antarctic ice shelf completely goes, guess how many feet in sea level rise we get?
23.
Yes, 23, approximately 23. That's right. So the problem, okay, yeah, it's easy to say all of this. It's easy to talk about sea level rise and say by the year, 2100, we likely will have, 1.4 meter sea level rise. The problem is that, none of us really operate on that kind of planning horizon. So the people that I deal with all the time, the coastal managers, the coastal commission, local cities and counties who are trying to make decisions about where they should be putting infrastructure, whether they should be allowing development along our coastal areas, what kind of flood insurance should be provided. All of these decisions happen on a much shorter time frame. And of course, elected officials come and go every 2 or 4 years, so they certainly aren't thinking about the kind of 90-year, 100-year time frame that the scientific community has used to try to communicate with us about these impacts. And that kind of disconnect is a major problem. Now, if you try to pin these scientists down and say, we need to know what we should expect, what kind of rate of change we should expect for sea level rise over this century, they still are having a very hard time figuring that out, because what they've observed already with Iceland and Western Antarctica is nothing that they expected. So it keeps blowing their models out of the water. Now, they seem to be getting more and more confident about the fact that these things are melting more quickly, and that's because they're observing that. But I would certainly encourage you, when Chris Eby comes in, to talk with her about this problem of the disconnect between the information that the scientific community is giving us and the suitability of that information for any kind of decent decision-making based on the planning horizons that human beings are used to.
Aren't insurance companies actually trying to factor some of this in, especially when they're exposed to coastal development insurance, stuff like that? I've heard they're actually a little bit more, receptive to these types of risks.
I have heard the same thing. And I would love nothing more than to get inside the heads and the boardrooms of these insurance companies to understand exactly what they're thinking and what kind of governmental policies they think would be appropriate. I do know that insurance companies are paying very close attention to expectations for increased frequency of storms and increased intensity of storms, these sort of catastrophic events that tend to trigger them, obviously. And in terms of sort of the long-term projections, I just can't answer your question right now. I have had students, in fact, I have a PhD student whom I share with Duke University who's focused exactly on this question of what kind of governmental policies should we be adopting given the kind of sea level rise that we can and should expect, at least in the next 50 years and then in the subsequent 50 years. And in particular, what kind of insurance schemes we should have and whether the government should be underwriting those schemes or whether they should be completely private. And it's really hard to get information out of the insurance companies. So. Coral bleaching, ocean warming. So corals, of course, are in our tropical regions, although we do have some deep sea corals that are accustomed to much colder weather. But the bulk of our large coral reef systems are in the southern hemisphere, and as I mentioned before, we attribute maybe 25% of our marine biomass is affiliated with coral reef systems in some very important way, so they depend on these coral reef systems for their own survival, some part of their life stage. They provide fundamental protein to millions and millions of people on Earth. And we've already experienced very serious coral bleaching events in our major coral reef systems. And coral bleaching occurs when sea surface temperatures elevate to 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade above normal tropical temperatures for a sustained period of time. So for about a week or two, when we start seeing these events, and sometimes they come right after each other, the algae that are associated with these corals and the corals themselves, basically their symbiosis falls apart. And we end up with a system where the corals die off and then the algae completely take over. And it becomes even more difficult when you combine that with overfishing, where the local populations in particular have grown to rely on the herbivores, who typically are the gardeners for our coral reef systems and are tending these and eating the algae. And when the herbivores have been removed for food, the reef systems have a very difficult time rebounding. The other thing that happens with our coral reefs with climate change is the increased storm intensity and frequency and the erosional force of those storms on coral reef systems. So they have it's like the 1, 2, 3 punch. They have a much harder time actually rebounding from the combination of higher temperatures and the erosional force of the storms. This has all been documented in the Great Barrier Reef. Ove Goldberg, whom I referred to before, has noted this, and it's a phenomenon that is very concerning to folks that live at these latitudes. There's great concern about climate change refugees, folks who have relied on coral reefs for their, not only for their primary protein, but also for their primary income. And when these systems are so badly damaged, and when we reach global temperatures beyond which they cannot rebound, the question is, what will happen to these people? What will they be eating? What is their food security? And how will they, what kind of livelihoods will they have? What's available to them? It's interesting, I've spent a lot of time with folks from the Southern Pacific, and actually there's a program that Stanford is involved in. It's called the First Nations Program. And this is a program where we bring in very young, promising young professionals, leaders from Hawaii and from New Zealand, from the Maori tribe in New Zealand, Native Hawaiians and New Zealanders. And we bring them to Stanford. They go to Hawaii, they go to New Zealand, they exchange stories and experiences in how they can retain their native customs and practices and be leaders in their own communities, but also they learn a great deal from the community here at Stanford about what is going on with the natural systems over which they are stewards. And they reported to me this year when I talked to them at Hopkins that there are large numbers of Micronesians who are already starting to migrate to New Zealand, and they really do attribute this migration that they're already seeing as a response to the food insecurity that these folks have. And so, whether you can say, oh, this is, the sole contributor is climate change is I think would be foolish. But certainly the continued impact of climate change on their natural systems and on the availability of their primary protein and their livelihoods is definitely having an impact, and it's impacting the places to which they are migrating. So enough of that. There are really cool things about the ocean that I wanted you to know, and one of them is that the ocean is highly stratified. we have an expert in density over here. So there's natural stratification that occurs. You've got temperature differentials, you've got salinity differentials, density differentials, biomass differentials in the ocean according to depth. And one of the things that we have observed as the globe has warmed, that where you draw these different these boundaries in the ocean, where you observe these boundaries is changing. The thermocline, the primary area where you see a primary temperature differential in the ocean is changing. The oxygen minimum layers in the ocean and where you see those boundaries is also changing. The oxygen minimum layer is actually raising up. The boundary is coming up. It's typically at the 200 to 600 meter level in the ocean, depth in the ocean, and it's coming, we're observing it as high as 100 meters from the sea surface. So ocean stratification is the sort of general classification of what I'm talking about here, and it's changing, and it's changing in ways that the scientific community is deeply interested in. They're very interested in how the stratification changes will be impacting the productivity of the oceans in particular. Ocean circulation, it's one global ocean. The point of this slide is really meant to alert you to the fact that we're seeing changes in our upwelling centers and our downwelling centers. There's great concern about the Gulf Stream and how temperature changes will affect the Gulf Stream, which in turn will affect weather and climate for folks who are around the Atlantic. So stay tuned for this. The scientific community is watching and recording changes in ocean circulation, and we've had some really interesting things happen along the western United States. Some events that have occurred that the scientific community is interested in figuring out whether or not they really are linked to climate change. Because ocean circulation is driven by a number of things. It's driven by winds, it's driven by precipitation, it's driven by temperature differentials. All of these things, of course, are actually features of our global climate that are changing in their own right as a result of the increased greenhouse gas concentrations in our atmosphere. So it stands to reason that ocean circulation also would be changing. And the kinds of events that I'm referring to is that the winds in the Pacific that typically drive and activate our upwelling centers, and upwelling is where the very warm water that typically is sitting on the, well, it doesn't feel warm to us, but it's the Pacific Ocean, and believe me, it's warmer than the cold stuff down below. The warm water is actually pushed off the coast from a combination of the winds picking up and the rotation of the Earth, and that warm water is pushed off away from the coastline, and the very cold water in the deep ocean comes up, and that cold water actually brings with it a ton of nutrients. And it's basically these upwelling centers along our California coast are sort of the cafeteria for marine organisms. And what has happened most recently, I believe 1995, excuse me, was the big event along the western United States was the winds did not pick up and the upwellings did not occur. They were delayed by a number of months, several months. The problem is that a bunch of the wildlife that depends on that cafeteria being ready for when their chicks hatch, for example, were not able to feed their chicks and sustain themselves because the upwelling didn't occur, the plankton wasn't there, they couldn't feed on the good stuff that feeds on the plankton, and we had a massive bird die-off in the western United States, and Terry can speak to that. So we're starting to observe changes like this and ramifications throughout the sort of the global food web, if you will, that we believe are associated with climate change. Storm intensity, I already talked about that. I talked about coastal erosion. I talked about the hypoxic zone and the oxygen minimum layer and how that's been changing. And there are winners and losers with all of this. So anybody know what this organism is here on the left? It's the Humboldt squid. Does anyone know which Stanford professor studies the Humboldt squid? Bill Gilley at Hopkins Marine Station studies the Humboldt squid. And the wild thing is, historically, the range for this animal, we believe the range for this animal was really down in the Baja California area. It's now being found up in Alaska. It appears to really thrive in this oxygen minimum layer area. And so the hypothesis is that with the changes in the oxygen minimum layer in the ocean that may be associated with climate change, this organism may actually, he's changing his range. He's moving northward. He's taking advantage of this anoxic zone that other organisms can't tolerate because they're not adapted to that. And, he may be the dominant force in Monterey Bay before we know it, who knows, which will make Bill Gilley very happy because he loves studying this animal, although I think he'll miss, going down to Mexico. Anyways, the point of this slide really is that we're seeing organisms moving. We believe that there are winners and losers, and we may not like the changes that occur. This animal, for example, isn't very tasty. Unlike the calamari that the rest of us like to eat, this one is not found to be a good source of food. Yeah. So this is the whole issue of the domino effect with habitat changes and range changes and altered food webs has really important consequences for some of the animals that we care deeply about or we think we care deeply about. Some of them just because we treasure them as species, others because we rely on them for protein. This slide I really wanted to put in here. We just completed a major review of all the scientific literature on the Pacific Ocean to figure out what the primary threats to the Pacific are so that we could think carefully about whether there's something that the Center for Ocean Solutions could do about those major threats. And what we found is that the threats really fall into 4 categories, which probably won't be surprising to you. Habitat degradation, overfishing, pollution, and climate change. Those first 3, habitat destruction, overfishing, and overexploitation, and pollution, those are really traditional stressors that we know how to control. This is not rocket science. We know how to deal with these things. We don't tend to do a very good job of it, and I would argue that part of our problem is that we don't look at these problems holistically, but we definitely know how to curtail our activities and control our activities to reduce those impacts associated with those 3 stressors. Add to that climate change, and it really complicates matters a great deal. Each of those stressors interact with each other. There are synergistic effects, there are additive effects, there may be some synergistic negative effects, which would be great. But by and large, they tend to interact with each other in ways that are even more damaging than the single stressor alone. And climate change just tends to make that even worse. So We've got our work cut out for us, and we have a lot of knowledge and expertise about how to curtail these traditional stressors, and climate change is just making that, that more urgent. So I want to close with a film that we created. We created the See You in Copenhagen film for Advance of Copenhagen, and this is a film that speaks for itself.
The life as we know it started in the ocean. Atmosphere-ocean interactions is the buzzword inside the climate science community because it's not a chicken and egg. They both work together.
The critical knowledge we need to better understand global warming right now is to put large investments into understanding the atmospheric ocean coupling. Our planet is 2/3 water. Our data sources are primarily from the skin of the ocean surface. There needs to be a monumental effort in the next decade to build an in situ monitoring system for studying the ocean weather, the biology of the ocean, so that we can actually build the models that are required to better understand what is happening now on this planet, what will happen 10 years, 50 years, and 100 years from now.
When I drive home tonight, some carbon dioxide is going to come out of the tailpipe of my scooter, and it will start spreading through the atmosphere. Probably within weeks, the air that contains that excess carbon dioxide will waft over the ocean somewhere and start going into the oceans. Within a year or two, more or less, the whole surface ocean will feel that excess carbon dioxide that I added to the atmosphere.
We are now becoming a major player in the carbon cycle. How much carbon is moving around the planet? And most of that's happening in the atmosphere in the upper ocean. We put out 8 billion tons of carbon as CO2 mainly that is absorbed by the ocean.
So one of the pathways for the CO2 molecule is that it comes into the ocean, reacts with water, forms carbonic acid, and then a proton comes off and attacks this building block that the coral needs to grow or other shellfish need to grow. I think there's a question with climate change generally, that it looks like if we don't stop producing devices that emit carbon dioxide very soon, that we're going to lose Arctic ecosystems, we're going to lose coral reefs. And I think it's a real question, are these just the first two systems that we know about?
All the CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere, it looks like about 30 to 40% immediately goes into the ocean. The deep ocean breathes. Deep ocean waters connect to the surface and connect to the atmosphere only in the polar regions. Air doesn't store much heat. Where heat gets stored on the planet right now is in the ocean.
The Earth has been hot before. It was hot when the dinosaurs were around. But the only time that chemistry changed as radically as we might do this century are at times of great mass extinctions.
Temperature and productivity play a key role in why an animal moves north or south. As Earth warms, these factors are going to change. How it will influence migrations, we're just learning.
When we look at what we see today and compare it to what we saw when we first started making these measurements, we could say things have changed. Things really have changed in terms of the vertical distribution patterns of animals, probably influenced by temperature, stratification, and oxygen concentration.
As we lose species that might be important intermediate prey, it's going to start to destabilize food webs.
What happens with the impact of, say, the loss of coral reef and habitat is that the less fish we're seeing That's all exacerbated by overfishing as well and a lack of control. The less fish we're seeing means people are doing other things, they're going out further, and it's not getting better. The immediate threat that people are concerned about is rising sea levels and, of course, the warming of the ocean. Also, with rising sea levels, the reality with many of our communities now settled on the shorelines.
As we start warming the oceans, not only do they expand and make the sea level rise, but when it gets warmer, it melts Greenland, which is now melting faster than anybody's been able to record or even understand. And we're worried about meters of sea level rise in centuries associated with the fact that we've been messing with the oceans in a way where it's going to feed back on the land, which is going to run off and change the height of the oceans and maybe force billions of human beings to abandon trillions of dollars of infrastructure to have to move inland.
I think the only thing we know now is it's going to be a different world. It's going to be a different ocean, and I can't tell you how different it's going to be.
To conclude with just a few thoughts about Copenhagen. And you have a copy of a paraphrased version of the Accord. Has anybody taken time to actually look at that and read it? So, I take your points absolutely. And one of the ironic things with the UNFCCC is that they never could agree on procedural rules other than to agree that they would operate by consensus. And you all know how crazy that is to have 193 countries represented in a huge room and expect to achieve a decision as important as this and as difficult as this by consensus. And essentially what that means is that any single country can basically thwart the effort. And so that's one problem. I think in terms of looking forward, I'm really interested in whose group you sign up for because what we found in Copenhagen in that second week, and I went in the second week, arrived there the second week, was that very important groups of countries, the EU, for example, kind of disappeared from the scene and lost their voice in the negotiations. And Japan, lost its voice in the negotiations. So we now have what is essentially, we've moved away from a legally binding document to a document that really is requesting domestic pledges, voluntary commitments. So that's a major architectural change in global climate change negotiations, moving away from legally binding agreements to ones that are basically voluntary commitments. And we've got a deadline on this accord. There's a January 31st, 2010 deadline asking countries to sign up on the appendix, and to write their country's name down and write down what their country's commitment will be. And I'm dying to know what President Obama is going to put down on in that appendix. I'm dying to know what the EU is going to write. I'm dying to know what China is going to write and what Japan is going to write, what AOSIS is going to write down there. So this is a really important deadline coming up. It could be a very important deadline coming up. And it's very uncertain what key players like the EU are going to do and what the United States is going to do. Yeah. It's true, a lot of issues were not resolved. Many issues we did make headway on, and I want to leave you with a positive thought. So I would say there are 3 areas where the Accord actually made progress and where the negotiations made progress and where there were significant advances in the text. You hear about the text all the time. That is in financing and the funds, the foundation of which has been set up in the Accord. Dealing with deforestation and REDD in particular, we made advances there. And adaptation, commitment to helping countries that are going to be most affected with adaptation. So those are 3 areas where I think we have cause for celebration, that we actually did achieve something in Copenhagen. A really good foundation was laid. There's a lot more that we need to do, and there are a lot of questions about these voluntary commitments and how we're going to hold countries to them, because we failed so deeply with Kyoto, and which was meant to be legally binding. But there is cause for some optimism, and I think there's a huge amount of anxiety globally about what we're going to do over the next 12 months and what's going to happen on January 31st. So stay tuned.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.